why the right is being defeated. And what can we do about it? Now, it might be disheartening or seemingly incorrect to say the right is being defeated, but if we even look at the history of the world from 6,000 years ago to the present, we can see the steady growth of liberal ideas and institutions, even to the point where the Israelites asked for a king to be over them, as the pagans have. And we have adopted this rejection of God, and it's even become a very contentious issue with many Christians who say that we're obligated to be obedient to the government, which is a yes but no kind of position or question, because if we are foolish enough to accept a leader, a secular leader, then yes, it would be beholding to us to obey him and not create dissension. That doesn't mean that we're supposed to have a king over us. It's a rejection of God, as God says. And so the problem is the right has adopted all of these left-leaning and unbiblical ideas and institutions, and we are wondering why we are being steadily pushed back and why we're steadily losing ground. If we move up to 60 years ago, or into the 60s, we can see from that point the push from the left has gained great momentum, primarily through the sexual revolution and its focus on gay rights and transgenderism, and then the multiplicity of genders, gender identity movement, and it's used this to dominate a whole lot of areas in society, and to pretty much dominate the political sphere. And we notice that the left has gained control of the media, the educational establishment, right from kindergarten to the university. The political realm is almost dominated by the left, even though we have right parties, conservative parties. Many of these are quite left-leaning to what would have been the case. And I'm not advocating for a libertarian or radically right political party, because the problem is that we're dealing with liberal ideas, liberal institutions, and a libertarian government, the best it can do is to be voted in through democracy, accept democracy, and push for greater freedom for capitalism, for the private property owners of the means of production. And these are liberal ideas. So when we gain power on the right, we're pushing the left's agenda in a more moderated, more restricted form, but we're still pushing the left. And then when the left gets in, it carries on in a more dramatic and dynamic way. But democracy, this idea that a majority can dictate to the minority, is not a conservative position. Even capitalism is said to be on the right, but it's more about image than reality. It has attributes that would um, align it with the right, but it's a marketing ploy, a message. Capitalism uh, sells to us, but the reality is something quite different. And by this we mean capitalism is aligned with the free market. It's aligned with the idea of entrepreneurship and the individual who just wants to make a living providing goods and services to the public. And ideally, this would align capitalism with the right, but it's functionally impossible for capitalism to actually be on the right. So, in theory, it's a right institution, but in fact, it becomes a liberal agency because capitalism is aligned with the state, and it easily morphs into and has morphed into globalism. The left can turn into or manifest as fascism and communism, but capitalism can just as easily adopt both these attributes because in many ways the most capitalist institution is the Chinese government or North Korea, because the whole country is run as a very large corporation. And where someone wants to draw the line between mom and pop running their corner store and the North Korean dictator running the nation as a free enterprise institution is really quite random. There's no point at which mom and pop ceases and Kim Jong begins. It's a continuum. So the institutions of this world, the government, the democracy, and if you want to go into fascism and communism and dictatorships and so on, are all on the left. Democracy is little more than a tyranny of the majority, and it becomes moderated by creating what's called representative democracy, where the majority will is manifested in a government that then represents the totality of the population, including those who didn't vote and who voted against them. The representation isn't very good, and there's a good reason for this, namely that if Mr. Joe Blow wants to be voted in next election, he has to some degree support the ideas and values of his base, those who are members of his party and those who voted for him. If he feels the ones against him or who voted for the other party are being discriminated against societally, and puts all his energy, or the energy of the government, to correcting this oversight, he could find himself ousted during the next election. And while some degree of equalizing disparate elements of society is expected, the government by necessity must keep up the appearance of being on whichever side of the political spectrum they are said to represent. So representative democracy is a way to smooth over the worst problems of direct democracy. Capitalism can't exist without private ownership, and private ownership is a minority right, because it's the minority that owns the capital. It's the minority that succeeds at amassing wealth. So capitalism is unable to exist without the state and the state's legalization and justification of property rights. The right tends to support capitalism, and sometimes it goes as far right as libertarianism. But libertarianism and liberalism are all from the same root word, liberty. And while liberty is a good thing idealistically, in reality we need to have constraints upon society. There has to be order, and there has to be some kind of accountability. And the market, what we might call the open market, doesn't have that kind of accountability. The idea that if I operate my business really foolishly and go bankrupt, then the open market has penalized me and punished me for my incompetence, is naively interesting, but it doesn't really pay the bills, as it were. When a company abuses its workers and the resources under its command and so on, and leaves behind massive amounts of debt and destroyed environment and so on, this is a debt paid for by society. The open market, or what capitalists call the free market, doesn't force people to pay costs that they don't have the means to pay. If I owe $1 million in damages, I haven't got the actual cash, who's going to lend it to me to pay anyone? The only way I can pay if I'm bankrupt is through borrowing. So, and nobody's going to lend it. So therefore I cannot pay my debt. So society and future generations pay this cost. This isn't the free market. It's definitely not being accountable for what we do. And indeed, why is a person enabled to leave behind these costs and this devastation when they can't pay the bill? What we're saying, the right is failing because we don't have the institutions on the right by which we could be allowed to succeed. Our politics and our economics are both on the left. Capitalism and communism are separated by private and public ownership, but private ownership is still semi-autonomous, not fully autonomous. It's still dependent on the state. The political right is still dependent on democracy, and democracy is a left institution. If we see the right as being accountable for the cost it creates, and the left as creating social cost or externalizing cost, we see the left as institutions and activities that create cost that are paid for by external elements, then democracy and all our economic systems are all on the left, because they all require these kind of externalizations. They create social costs. So what is on the right apart from the church? But even the church is corrupted and remastered as a kind of leftist organization, because the church doesn't exist on a basis of accountability. And one of the key factors of the church is that we must be accountable to each other. But this is very superficial, the kind of accountability that the church engages in, because we're only accountable in a kind of a spiritual, social sense. We're not accountable in an economic sense. We don't build up the church in a physical way, but works done in faith must have a physical basis. The church isn't just a spiritual body. We're in the world, and so we have to build up the church in the world as a world organization or institution. So the right really is an idea that has never manifested into real world institutions, and we're failing because all our efforts are channeled through institutions that belong on the left. Our church, our government, our economics are all on the left, and all our efforts to manifest conservative values are channeled and passed through this prism of left-leaning ideology. And so conservatives are basically just people who are trying to slow down the change we're preserving, or trying to preserve culture that is being eroded away. We're not an actual opposition force. We're a kind of reactionary element within the left. And so the objective here is to come together and to build an actual right institution. We need to build the church.